We got the fantastic Jane Hardy. Who's a member of the home county's SWP.
It's true.
She's an ex-academic. She joined the revolutionaries, and she does a lot of research, and she contributes to the Journal of International Socialism. And Jane Hardy will be speaking for 30 to 35 minutes, and the session is called Can Corbynomics Works? So Jane, the floor is yours.
Well, I have to say this is the first time I've had a warm-up at Marxism, but it's a great thing. Unfortunately, others were going to be debating, and then Graham Turner, but nobody's been able to come, so I don't know whether I should take it personally or whether or not people are simply busy. So, I think the starting point of the meeting has to be that Corbyn's economic policies are a really welcome break from the sort of market-driven economics that have dominated and wreaked havoc with the lives of ordinary people. What they promise is a break with the neoliberal policies that we've had for 4 decades. Started under Callaghan in 1976 and very, very enthusiastically carried out by Thatcher and Blair. On top of that, the draconian austerity policies after the financial crisis have brought poverty, homelessness, falling wages, deteriorating services for ordinary people, while lining the pockets of the rich. So in that sense, it's very, very welcome. And the ambitiousness of the project is summed up by John MacDonald, who says that he wants to surpass even the Attlee government of 1945 for radical reform. The situation demands nothing less. So in that sense, we're offered a very radical programme. But what we need to question is whether or not these promises can be delivered. And I'm going to make 4 arguments, and I'm going to lay them out there right now, just in case I don't get to the end. But firstly, I want to argue that however much a break with neoliberalism the 2017 manifesto is, it is still very cautious and conciliatory about big business. Number 2, history matters. And if we look at the 2 Labour governments before Blair, they were brought to heel by capitalists at home and abroad. 3, the Keynesian policies that have underpinned the whole project has a very limited capacity to deal with economic problems, and it has no capacity to deal with economic crisis. And 4, the issue of workers' participation and democracy is very, very important. It's at the centre of the manifesto, and I want to argue that even in its best form, it can't defy the logic of capitalism. So in short, those are the arguments, and we'll just see how many of those I managed to develop. So, how many people have looked at the 2017 manifesto for the many, not the few? Right, a few of you. Well, there are many reasons to be cheerful if you look at that manifesto. It promises to talk about democratic ownership, bringing the railways, the utilities, gas, electricity and water back into public ownership. It even talks about those parasitic companies, the Sercos, the Capitas, the Carillions, who've leached 200 billion from the public purse and managed in some cases to even not deliver what they promised by going bankrupt. So it even talks about those. The manifesto aims to double the size of the cooperative sector and talks about allowing employees to have first refusal if a company is up for sale. They talk about setting up a national transformation fund of 250 million over 10 years, rebuilding communities that have been ripped apart by globalisation, and talking about regional redistribution. And of course that's another welcome change after the sort of slavish adoration of the city by people like Blair and Brown. And finally, we can be very happy that they talk about reducing boardroom pay to 20 times that of the average worker. At the moment, the average worker, or the other way around, that CEOs get 145 times more than the average worker. So those sort of obscene levels of wealth and the growing inequality. Now, having said that, I think there are some areas of the manifesto that at best lack ambition and are extremely cautious. If we take taxation, 19% is the current rate of corporation tax. Anyone want to have a guess how many countries in the EU have a lower rate of tax?
None.
Not none, 3. Hungary, Romania and Ireland. In France and Germany, they have rates of 30%. Even in the US, depending on the state, they have corporation tax at 27%. And this is what the manifesto says. A new settlement with business will ask large corporations to pay a little more, while keeping UK corporation tax amongst the lowest of the major developed economies. I don't think that's very ambitious. You know, why shouldn't we raise a much more ambitious demand of putting corporation tax of at least the same as that of comparable economies? Another kind of red light to me in that manifesto was called the fiscal credibility rule. Now, I've noticed several people have nodded off at that, but what that means is it's an appeal to the city, and the emphasis is on balancing the books. So there's words like sound finances, words like a laser-like focus on spending. And what it's about balancing the books. Now, I find it quite bizarre that there is, you know, even within social democratic terms, there is no problem with governments borrowing money, and historically all governments have borrowed lots of money. Now, the problem with that is the combination of modest tax increases and promising, in effect, not to borrow means that it really ties the hand of any future Labour government in terms of delivering on some of their more ambitious promises. So, those I'm not going to talk about other things within the manifesto, but I think those are things that we should particularly take note of. Now, secondly, history matters. And if I was playing advocate to my own argument, which I now have to because no one else has turned up to debate me, one of the things that I might say is well, you know, you criticise this manifesto, but a Labour government's got to be cautious in the first instance, but what they can do when they get into power is they can become more radical. I think that's what I might say if I was one of the people that hadn't turned up for the debate. What I would say in response to that is it's very instructive to look at the two Labour governments previous to Blair. Now, Blair doesn't count because he made no pretence of any sort of radicalism except that along lines of neoliberalism. And we'll just say something about the Harold Wilson government in 1964. Now, this Labour government was not elected on any sort of a socialist platform. Not only did Harold Wilson, I would say, not pose any threat to capital, he was very friendly towards it. What was he promising? He was promising to help struggling UK firms to compete and to run the economy better than the Conservatives beforehand. So a little taste of the sort of things he said is that this involved getting the deadwood out of Britain's boardrooms and replacing them with keen young executives, production engineers and scientists. That was a modernising agenda, not a socialist agenda. And of course his very famous phrase that some of you might have heard was that Britain was going to be forged in the white heat of technology. So he was promising to modernise British capitalism and deal with its problems. However, even in its very modest intentions, it was part of a system of international finance who had no confidence whatsoever in Britain's ailing economy. And rather than let Harold Wilson and his government get on with making Britain more competitive, what they did is they brought him to heel by selling the pound, selling sterling. So what that meant is the Bank of England had to constantly prop up the pound. Now, Harold Wilson actually did say something that was quite interesting. He did have some understanding of the sort of power of international finance, and it's worth reading what he said because it's very prophetic. He said, "You cannot go cap in hand to the central bankers and maintain your freedom of action. Before long, they will be demanding that Britain put her house in order, and their ideal of an orderly house usually comes to mean vicious inroads into the welfare state and a one-sided pay pause. The government would then launch into savage cuts. The brunt will fall on wages, on salaries, on ordinary families struggling to make ends meet." In fact, really, that could have been my meeting, that particular quote. Very prophetic, because within weeks of becoming Prime Minister, the Bank of England was demanding immediate cuts in welfare to appease international speculators. In 1966 onwards, very big cuts in the welfare state, pay freezes, and in short, the Labour government, having inherited a weak economy, was a pawn in the hands of world bankers, and the promises that were made in his manifesto were sacrificed to reassure that international capital. Moving on a bit to 1974 was the Wilson and then Callaghan government. And really the same old story with a different twist. They were elected on a very high crest of militancy amongst working class trade unions, and their programme of the alternative economic strategy was far in excess in terms of radicalism than the current manifesto. It promised very radical public ownership, taking shares of 25 of the largest manufacturing companies, forcing them, imagine that, to enter planning agreements and imposing workers' participation. They went further in terms of trying to dismantle Britain from the international system of capitalism by proposing controls on currency, controls on investment, and even leaving the European Union. And in other words, what Tony Cliff and Charlie Kimber called revamped nationalist Keynesianism. Well, what happened again was that by the mid-1970s, the British economy was mired in very deep problems of economic problems. Some of its major flagship firms were in big trouble and were actually nationalised. There were deep problems with inflation and unemployment, what they called stagflation. And again, come into the picture, big business and the city clamouring for spending cuts along with the International Monetary Fund to get into, to rein in the profligate Labour government. And if any of you don't know the International Monetary Fund, it's a sort of financial policeman of the world who will lend you money on condition that certain policies are followed. And those policies are invariably cuts in spending, cuts in spending. In other words, putting and wage restraint, putting the burden of any crisis onto working class people. 1976, things came to a head and the government was forced to borrow 17 billion in today's money from the IMF. And the strings were enormous cuts in spending in 1967 and 1978. Now, the other significant thing about that was that it was a turning point in history when the Labour government officially abandoned Keynesianism, although, as I'll say later, it had never been implemented. And there was a very famous speech given at conference when Callaghan announced the party was over and they simply were not going to spend their way out of recession. Peter Riddell, who was the then editor of the Financial Times, said if there was a Thatcher experiment, it was launched by Dennis Healey. So, what are the lessons of those two governments? The lessons are that in both cases, good intentions were derailed, partly by the weak place of UK capitalism in the global economy, but the fact that international capital would not tolerate anything that threatened their own interest, and it would not tolerate any solution to an economic problem that did not involve putting the burden onto working class people in terms of restoring its competitiveness. So, okay. Thirdly, I just want to say something about Keynes, and I probably haven't got time to cover this fully. But the Corbyn economic project is underwritten by Keynesianism. And in brief, Keynesianism, as it is generally understood, involves a sort of technocratic solution to economic problems whereby you spend money when unemployment's going up, you dampen the economy when there's inflation. And this were the ideas that he put forward in the 1930s. And this is the idea that underpins really the Corbyn project. As an aside, it is worth just noting that Keynes was not a socialist. He didn't even support the Labour Party in the 1930s, and what he said was that the Labour Party was a class party, but their class is not my class, and the class war will find me on the side of the educated bourgeoisie. So, despite that, despite his very sort of dubious credentials in terms of politics, nevertheless his ideas were adopted in a big way, nominally, by the post-war Labour Party. Now, it's commonly accepted that Keynes's ideas were responsible for what now we call the long boom. But actually, it wasn't very long at all. It was about 20 years. And therefore, we should return to these ideas. But as Chris Harman points out, the most staggering fact was although these ideas were ruled as the official ideology and were championed for keeping crisis at bay, they were never really used. And if you look at the Labour governments and the Tory governments as well, rather than using this technocratic stop-go, spending, not spending, the economies were stop, stop and stop all the way through. So although a rhetoric of Keynesianism was used, it wasn't used in practice. Secondly, the one place that we could probably look at where Keynesianism has been tried is Japan, which is almost like Keynesianism on steroids, where they, in response to very slow and sort of stagnating economy, they tried to stimulate it with big spending, to no effect. 2013, they redoubled their efforts. They spent enormous, eye-watering amounts of money on trying to reflate the economy, spending money on infrastructure. They even had negative interest rates. Imagine, I mean, they're bad enough at the moment, but negative interest rates to try and get people to spend. But I think it's fair to say, and I don't think even bourgeois economists would disagree with me, that this had no impact in kicking the economy out of the doldrums. And thirdly, not something that I can spend a lot of time on, but the logic of Keynesianism, stimulating demand and causing greater production, that's not really the story. It's actually profitability in the economy that causes investment to rise. Past profits fund investment, and the expectation of future profits provides the incentive. We might have talk more about this in the discussion. So there are very fundamental problems with the idea of Keynesianism as a way of stimulating the economy. The fourth area that I want to talk about, which I think is very important, is one aspect of Labour's programme that promises to transform firms and make them more democratic. And this is laid out in another document called Alternative Models of Ownership. And John McDonnell made it clear that this would be an irreversible change towards worker-run public services. And there's a journal called Renewal, which describes itself as a journal of social democracy, and said that these proposals would amount to a radical programme for dismantling and displacing corporate and financial power in Britain, constraining and undermining the social and economic basis of the neoliberal order. So again, very fine words and very, very ambitious words in terms of how they think about democratising the economy. Now, of course, we all agree that privatisation has been disastrous for workers and for consumers, where parasitic corporations have leached huge amounts of money from us. And of course, the idea of workers' democracy is absolutely central for one demand that is raised by socialists. But workers' cooperatives are not the same as workers' democracy. We have to be very, very cautious about this. So, there are three issues. Firstly, what do we mean by workers' cooperatives? There are lots of models that have been used. For example, in Poland, it was a fig leaf for managers getting hold of companies at bargain basement prices. We've got Germany and Sweden that don't call themselves workers co-ops, but have some sort of participatory models. And even John Lewis calls itself, that some people refer to that as a workers' co-op. Now I think really, if the John Lewis model is the best example that we're offered of a workers' co-op, we might as well go home. So it's a very, there are very weasel words in there, and we have to look at the content and not the label. The second issue is one that's raised by Michael Roberts, which is that if public ownership is confined to the natural monopolies, the utilities, the railways, there are two arguments. First of all, we're pushing at an open door. There are, a vast number of people that vote Tory that would like to see those renationalised. But his argument is that it doesn't take over the commanding heights of the economy. It leaves quite untouched financial institutions, the banks, except when they're socialising the debt that somebody else has racked up, the banks, the investment banks. And, without nationalising or taking control of these larger institutions, it really limits the ability to deliver on some of the other promises to do with investment and so on. The third point, and in a way this is the most important, is the question of whether or not you can have a firm, a workers' cooperative, that is an island of socialism in a sea of capitalism. In other words, can firms run by workers defy the logic of capitalism? So I actually looked at a couple of examples that are very much quoted as being what we should be aiming at. One of them is the Third Italy, where there are lots of workers' cooperatives held up as a shining example. And what I found there is that there are associate workers. They are migrants who work on low and irregular wages. They experience racism and high workloads. So it is no panacea for everybody. And secondly, there's a very interesting book about the Mondragon cooperatives of the Basque Country, because they are held up again as the sort of example that we should be looking to. And the author did a study, and what she hoped to find was an example that she could take back to the US of workers' democracy and participation. But rather than finding a lack of class conflict and rather than finding that ownership motivated workers, her conclusion was that these cooperatives could not be shielded from the forces of the world market and the anarchy of competition. She found that they had to become more efficient and more competitive. They introduced efficiency studies by consultants. They increased the pace of production. They hired temporary workers. In other words, the workers faced exactly the same strains in the labour process as other workers. Shift work, routine work, ever-increasing exaltation to productivity. Worker ownership does not stop these pressures. So, again, if I was playing the devil's advocate, I could say, well, it's a start, and what are your examples? What are your examples of democracy at work? And I think there are examples that we can look to, not as many as we would like. But if we look at Portugal in 1974, when a group of young army officers rebelled against the fascist regime, what that did is it unleashed from below a revolution. There were 97 strikes in the first few days, quite often to get rid of bosses. There were occupations of multinationals, of shipyards, even of hotels, and the management of more than 1,000 workplaces was taken over by workers who took ownership of their workplaces. So these were proper cooperatives, even though they were perhaps short-lived, but in a tide of real social change. And there are some very interesting stories that they quite often weren't formally organised. And in the Plessy multinational, there was a commission of workers, of 118 workers, and they all insisted on going to meetings with management to ensure that they weren't sold out. So I think that it's a high level of struggle that is going to produce workers' cooperatives and give birth to new forms of democratic structures. I'm afraid it's not going to be concessions that a Labour government can wrest from a reluctant capitalist class who will be doing all they can to wrest that away. So I'm going to leave it there. Hopefully people will have some questions and contributions to make on that.
I would ask everybody to keep their questions and contributions to not more than 3 minutes. Once you reach 2 minutes, I'm going to tap on the table, and then you're going to have to sum up for the next minute. Then I'll tell you to be quiet if you go over that. We'll start with you, and then we'll go to you in the blue shirt, then we'll go to you in red.
Yeah, you mentioned the 1974 Labour government, and obviously the the IMF crisis of 1976, which happened a couple of years after they came to power. But to what extent was that about the economic situation purely in our country, and wasn't the biggest contributor to what happened like between, say, 74 and 79, actually the massive slamming on of the economic brakes that happened as a result of the 1973 oil crisis and the situation in the Middle East then?
Yeah, I think something really significant about Corbyn economics and just economics in general is, and the way people treat economics, is this mistake of looking at it from the point of view of consumption, which was touched upon in the meeting. And I think that's why you do get this kind of attitude of we need to work with capitalists sometimes, things like that, because it's just assuming we have to work and change the system, and also looking at it from a capitalist point of view. And I think that can be quite problematic at times and leads to a lot of these problems.
Great. I'll go to you in the green shirt, and then I'll go to you in the blue shirt.
Yeah, hi, I'm a public sector worker, and I'm also a unison shop steward, and I think like most sort of people who work in the public sector, you have arguments about Corbyn. Actually, I have arguments with people, a number of people who you have to argue, and I'd like to thank Jane for a meeting that's a very sobering meeting, actually, because you have a lot of people who think that voting, let's wait for Labour, let's wait for Jeremy, everything will be fine, and that's going to usher in radical change. And that's, it's quite horrible to sort of have to slap it down, and actually it's quite sobering to think, well, actually, even from day one, Corbyn will come up against such a buffer, and the whole notion that actually after the general election that there will be, radical change and stuff is quite sobering to know that that's not going to happen. And as I say, I've been having arguments with people about that for the last couple of years. But it's also quite hard because there's a number of people I'm also having arguments with from the opposite side who are saying, well, Corbyn's rubbish, why vote for him and stuff and this. And I think actually it's worth us remembering it's really important that we analyse Corbyn's policies and we analyse the economics, because actually as socialists we have to argue that we want radical change, and it's important that we have to argue against the illusions that that's going to sow. But it's also important to remember that actually the Tories are not going to offer anything else. Corbyn is at least selling a vision of society that we want to have better public services, that we want to fight to change. I mean, I work with young offenders, and actually the whole notion about school exclusions and stuff like that, at least Corbyn will start a discussion which will bring in hope. Actually, the Tories don't want to do that. But what's been quite funny over the last couple of days, I don't know if people saw Chris Patton being interviewed by the BBC. He was being interviewed about the Hong Kong protesters. But they asked him what he thought about the current Tory leadership, and he actually was quite scathing about both Boris Johnson and Jeremy Hunt's economic policies, and saying actually it's ridiculous, and it's important for us to remember, even though Corbyn's vision is the one that was actually ultimately could fail. Actually, the Tories are not offering anything else either, and I think I'd like James to actually come back and talk about what their policies bring, because I think their policies are bringing actually their disaster. And I think for us as socialists, what our job is actually to say, we want a Corbyn government, we want to fight change, because actually what we want to do, we want to from the ground upwards. It's not when we talk about the ruling class, actually the ruling class would love to hammer us, but if we create a movement from below that actually fights and puts pressure on them, the more far-sighted members of the ruling class have to say, well, actually, you know what, we can't go too far. So I think it's important for us to say that actually, yes, Corbyn his policies have got weaknesses, but at the same time say that we want to fight and we're still going to create
Jane did a very neat demolition of Corbynomics, and it's a shame there was nobody here to put the alternative argument, which is what I really came for. I'm a member of the SWP, by the way, so these are not new arguments to me from what Jane said. And it is sobering, as the previous speaker said, thinking about the problems that of what they will actually be able to deliver. But I think the main impact of a Corbyn election, government, will be political. It will raise the sights of millions of people that some kind of change is possible. And you can just the only way, look at the situation now. The only way a Corbyn government is going to come to power is if he goes back to the barnstorming campaigning style he did a couple of years ago. And you can see the potential for the thing to become really quite a dramatic event. It will be a very dramatic event if Jeremy Corbyn goes into number 10. But this brings me to the point that the first speaker raised about 1974. The key thing of the 1974 Callaghan government wasn't the fact that they were facing a capitalist crisis, so what's new, that's always happening, it comes in different ways. The key thing they did was to blunt the workers' struggle. They brought in a thing called the social contract, and it was the Labour government, allied with the left, on the left of the trade union movement, that held the workers' struggle down, which bound the people. So when the cuts came, the fight back was there, but it just wasn't strong enough to overcome the Labour government. They'd been undermined by their own leadership. Now this brings, if we're talking about a radicalised mass feeling of change and a Corbyn government, will the left be in a position to push it forward, to challenge the situation, challenge the repetition of what happened in 64 or what happened in 74? Can we overcome that next time? And the only way is through mass workers' struggle, and so therefore we're pushing it now. We want to get ready for the future, etc., etc. But that is the only way forward, and that's why the SWP exists. If there's anybody in here who's not in the SWP, that's why we exist. We don't want to go down the road that the Communist Party and the Labour left did in the 1970s. One final point. I come from Haringey in North London. 18 months ago, there was a massive struggle taking place around a huge social cleansing programme. Some of you may have heard of it. Just before Christmas, 3 days before Christmas in 2017, John McDonnell was invited to a Labour Party members-only meeting in Haringey to discuss the crisis in Haringey Council, and he lined himself up with the left. There were 5 SWP members in there as well. We were allowed to stay and witness what was going on. It's a very interesting meeting. But John McDonnell very clearly said in that meeting, any left council that comes in Haringey will have to abide by the law. You can't go for budgets that are going to break the law. You're going to have to implement the cuts. And you're going to have to implement the cuts and say it's all the fault of the Tories. This is a repetition in a small way and a potential way that they're going to deal with any crisis of a Labour government in the future. Don't blame us, blame capitalism, blame the Tories, blame somebody else, and it will undermine our own side. That kind of thing has happened before, it could happen again. We need to be prepared now for that kind of argument, and we need to be building up the struggle now to give people the confidence to challenge that kind of argument.
Okay. My name's BK, I'm from Sheffield and I work in the council. There's a couple of points I want to make. I work with a Labour Party member who's an absolute Corbynite. He's, really, really excited about the potential of Labour under Corbyn coming into power. And his big thing is nationalisation and how much that will transform things. And on one level, when you're working anywhere where there's been massive privatisations, the idea of nationalisation of industries is a great step forward. But I do think that for him that's the end of the struggle in a sense. He sees that as being the achievement, that's what we need, and from then it's almost like the golden age comes back. And I think we need to be very, very careful about that, because actually, yes, the state can subsidise services that are absolutely essential, and that's a great thing, but at the end of the day, workers will still be negotiating with the state about the rate of their exploitation. They're not going to be in control of those services, and actually they're still going to need to struggle in terms of getting better wages, all those kind of things. And the very services that we look to, like water, like fuel, travel, are things that actually should be free. They shouldn't be things that we have to pay. I know we pay less, but actually those things should be free. We should have a society where people don't have to worry about whether they pay their bills or whether they put the fire on, and even if the prices are better, there's still those sort of ideas that people have to go through. And I think, so for me, it's a step forward, but it's not the end of the argument at all. And I think the other example I want to give is about a few years ago, a lot of councils, mainly Labour councils, moved towards this idea of personal payments for adult care. And they argued that this meant people had greater control over their own money, a cooperative type of model in that sense. And actually what we saw was their payments immediately reduced by about 25%. They were relying on the private sector in terms of being able to actually find services. What happened in most situations was that they brought in family to provide care, so their family wages were much lower. They weren't trained in terms of the things they were doing, and actually the rate of abuse in those situations started to increase in terms of vulnerable adults. So I think we have to have a balance, which is that, yes, things like nationalisation, state control, those sort of things are a huge step forward to what we've got now, but actually they're still exploitative, they're still capitalist, and they're still going to need us to fight. And ultimately what we want to be able to do is provide care and provide basic amenities for people without having to worry about cost, and have much more level of control, i.e. a socialist society at the end of the day.
Hi, can people hear me? Yeah. I think, first of all, we have to thank John McDonnell in particular for breaching the mainstream consensus around neoliberalism that's existed in British politics for decades. And in that sense, it's fundamentally important we start from saying, as Simon and other people have said, this raises people's expectations, it opens up a debate, and that's extraordinarily important, just as it is with Sanders in America and lots of other figures around the globe who open up these debates about whether economics could be run differently. That's a starting point for us. Secondly, though, we have to say, Corbyn and MacDonald are well-intentioned, well-meaning socialists. So what are the limits, therefore, of the radicalism? Because if you look at the concrete measures, in many ways they're not that radical, but in the grand historical scheme of things. The limits to the radicalism are that even the most radical reformists believe that fundamentally you can reconcile the interests of workers and capitalists around a shared national interest. And if you're a revolutionary, you believe that those fundamental contradictions between workers and capitalists can't actually be eradicated or reconciled, and that you need therefore class struggle to advance a serious programme of transformation of society. That's the fundamental difference. Now that's really important, because if you look at how many people on the radical left respond to the limitations of some of Corbyn's and MacDonald's political economic measures, what they try and do is they look for a clever sort of ruse to escape from the problem of class confrontation. I'll give you two examples. The first one is people's quantitative easing. Doesn't actually form a major part of John McDonnell's thinking anymore, but the idea you can just print money and solve all these problems is a way of sidestepping the class struggle. It won't actually solve the fundamental class conflict in British society, and it won't work. I'll give you a second example. They're talking now a little bit about using universal basic income. I'm against universal basic income, because actually, unless you're going to swallow up 50-60% of GDP and completely transform the class relations of capital, which no one's talking about, by the way, all you're doing is taking a little bit of money to subsidise low-wage work. It's not going to fundamentally transform the system, and it's a way of sidestepping the problem of class struggle. Now, we have to say, if you look at Corbyn's manifesto, it's fantastic. It's great that it's raising expectations. The problem with the manifesto is that it's designed to do two things. Firstly, satisfy Corbyn's supporters, and secondly, not disturb too much the people in the City of London. The problem is it's going to fail on both counts. It is going to disturb the people in the City of London. There's going to be bitter attempts to overthrow a Corbyn government, as we know. But even if you start introducing these radical forms, it doesn't go far enough to meet the needs of working class people. And for both reasons, we have to talk about a programme of working class struggle around a radical series of demands that can begin to challenge the framework of the capitalist system and ultimately can push beyond it and lead to the real transformation that will completely transform working class life.
Thank you very much. That was an excellent talk. I think that what others have said about the importance and centrality of working class struggle and the limitations of radical reformism are clear, and I think we can take for granted. Nonetheless, I think for me, there was a gap. Maybe you will come to that later, because whilst you're completely right that both in the 70s and probably even more so today, the British economy is a declining force in the global economy. It is still a big economy, 6th biggest economy in the world. The British state has huge resources and so on. So in trying to, in seeking to understand what a program of radical demands can be I would have hoped that we could explore some of that a little bit more. What are the minimum expectations that socialists can have in arming people who want to fight back, but also in holding the Corbyn supporters to the necessity of raising the bar and so on. Otherwise, we might get to the situation where there'll be a justification to say if you try too much, there'll be capital flight, global capital will screw you up, and short of revolution, you can't really do much. That is a conclusion that many people have drawn. We saw what Syriza did and so on. I'm from Africa, obviously a continent populated by states infinitely much more weaker in the global pecking order than Britain. And people still expect that radical governments and states ought to be able to rein in capital to some degree and begin a process of transformation. I'm not saying that we ought to sow any illusions about in the states or governments as being the agents of fundamental change, but nonetheless, people ought to be able to raise those demands and ought to be able to justify those demands even within the parameters of what exists, even within the parameters of things that fall well short of Portugal in 1974 and so on. So what then, I would like to ask, could be the type of things that even within the constraints of capitalism that exists today, that a radical government can undertake, or people can make demands of that radical government to undertake, especially a government with the kind of resources that the British state has. And the last speaker, Joe, referred to a program of radical demands. And I know that historically, people in the SWP tradition or the IS tradition, incidentally, I am a member of the International Socialists myself in Ghana, have hesitated about things like the things that you mentioned earlier on, and alternative economic strategies and so on. So I hope I'm not causing any mischief, but what would be an alternative economic strategy now to argue with, to take into the barnstorming campaigns that we would hope that the Corbynites will do, and be able to work independently and push forward the class struggle that we want, that we know is the only means of bringing about fundamental change as well.
Thank you. I'm a member of the SWP in Kingston, southwest London. Basically, in response to what has been said before, and particularly by Jane in her speech, I had thoughts coming to me, and it was mainly to do with not forgetting that since Corbyn has become the leader of the Labour Party, the party is going to be the biggest in Europe in terms of membership. It has been able to rally an awful lot of discontent within different shades of colour, if you like, of the left in the UK. To me, we have to be a little bit careful about chipping away at the programme as presented in the manifesto. Sort of picking faults is not radical enough. Yes, it's not radical enough. It's a Labour Party manifesto. Is not a socialist revolutionary manifesto. However, to me, the biggest danger is he's not in power yet. What are the prospects of him implementing the manifesto policies? I think a lot of it will depend on our ability to mobilize so that he does not feel he's the isolated lefty leader within his party, should he ever go into power, that will be henpecked or cockpecked by everybody else in the party, all the right and all the moderates. So to me, as working class, we need to mobilize and be prepared to organize and perhaps go into general strike should there be infighting within the Labour Party once he takes power, if he does. So can we as revolutionaries find the strength to mobilize and support even a less than revolutionary manifesto, provided that all that is presented in it is not chipped away and taken away. Thank you.
It's quite, sorry, my name's Dick Pitt from Sheffield. It's very comforting that we're all singing from the same song sheet. There's a but there. and that everyone here, I hope, will be prepared to mobilise for Corbyn, because it is an expression of hope, and people do need to get mobilised. There is a problem in that the problem is that there is a layer of people who think, get Corbyn elected and then it'll all be all right. And I think the example of the 74 government is classic. The working class was incredibly well organised. Whole strings of strikes have brought down the Labour government. There was massive, the Tory government got the Labour government in. Massive hope for it. The manifesto said, we will bring about a fundamental and irreversible shift in the balance of power and wealth in favour from working people in favour of working people and their families. Incredibly radical, way more radical than Corbyn. What actually happened was, and this is the classic with the reformists, you're in office, you've got to run the system. And so they got into negotiation. The union leaders had a deal to have a pay freeze, a pay incomes policy. 74, there was an income policy agreed. Not a single union in the country objected. This is Dennis Healey, the Chancellor of the Exchequer. The most impressive thing that has been the speed with which members of the General Council of the TUC have reached a voluntary agreement to limit pay, which means a reduction in real take-home pay for the majority. The Observer commented that the pay freeze, the last 12 months have almost certainly seen the sharpest fall in real living standards of Britain's working population in any year for the last century. And that, to me, is the central issue. We do have to mobilise, but we've all had hopes raised with Syriza and various others. The key thing is, if you mobilise and stay mobilised, you stand a chance of fighting the bankers. If you don't and walk away, we will lose.
Okay. First, I don't want Corbyn to be Prime Minister for one single reason. Corbynomics is capitalism. And that, I think, everyone is agree on that. I want no more poverty. I want no more working class exploitation. And that cannot be set up in capitalism. And that's why I'm not advocating for Corbyn to become Prime Minister. Because if I do so, when I see someone say and tell him, well, you will have to vote for Corbyn in the next election, what will I say? Yes, but I will still work the same, and I will still continue to be exploited by a boss. Yes, I know, but that's why you need to struggle. Yes, but I will have to struggle against Corbyn. I will have supported before. I think it's a nonsense. We cannot hold this line. Because there are several references to 1974. I think the role of a Labour government regarding of the bourgeoisie is to calm down the social anger. Is to calm down all the organised working class and to make them slowly getting into the jobs and have social peace. And that's why they did in France in 2012 when Hollande gets elected. 2 years before, you had a 2 million strike against a pension system, and then Hollande get elected, and he had a leftist he had a right economics, and that's why I mean. It's just we have to organize the working class by ourselves. We don't need Labour to do that. We don't need the Labour to do that, because when you're saying that the Labour is the main left party, yes, okay, but are the workers in the Labour Party or in the factory? That's all. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm Jerry Lyons from Waltham Forest Council. A councillor in Waltham Forest. We're talking about what attacks the Corbyn government would come under, what attacks, and some people have said it already, what attacks Corbyn will come under these things are already happening. It's already happening. They are so frightened of him for whatever reason. You know, that every Labour leader, come the summer, the Tory press want to get rid of them, you know, run stories against the Labour leader. But the difference is that there are huge parts of the Labour Party that have joined in with the newspapers. That hasn't happened with other leaders. There's been no honeymoon period for Jeremy Corbyn. They were attacking him as soon as he decided to run for leader. And so that's already happening. And, you know, one of the guys in Trump's government or administration they have over there, Trump's administration, has said the US will not stand back and let Corbyn just be elected. You know, this is the real fear. So, you know, it's great to talk about what Corbyn government will do, but, you know, we're nowhere near that at the moment. There is attacks from everywhere, and people are who are not as active in politics are watching it on the TV every day. Corbyn is rubbish, you know, he's sick, he's an old man, he's this and that. You know, never really... The forces of capitalism, you know, even civil servants are saying, the forces of capitalism are attacking him now and have been for quite a while. And it's very difficult to counter. And it will be great if he gets in, and that raises people's hope. And when people see that the sky doesn't fall in, maybe then they will be ready for us to go further and say, look, he's a socialist and the sky hasn't fallen on our heads. Let's get radicalised and go further. That's great. But we have real problems with capitalism attacking him now.
We spoke earlier about well, you know, we don't want Corbyn elected. It is worrying, and when the comrade from the Labour Party came back, I thought that was very important. One of the things we've got to remind ourselves is that, yes, we've got criticisms about the limitations of Corbynomics, but the truth of the matter is we are desperate to get a victory at the moment. We are desperate to be able to shift the whole direction of the political debate in societies to the left, and it's absolutely critical. We're going to have to fight our way through the whole argument around Brexit and all the problems that's going to cause that is attempting to hijack the very tough battle of arguing for austerity, getting that at the centre of this agenda. And my feeling is, if we do that, if Corbyn was elected, what would be the ramifications across the planet at the moment? A sudden shift of a major industrial country that elects, all right, a social democratic leader, but a social democratic leader with some kind of political pedigree on the left. How's that going to play out in America, in France, in Germany? And I can also see where confidence can take place, where disputes take place under Corbyn, and suddenly there's solidarity campaigns and people suggesting perhaps that people will come out and strike on solidarity, and they say, well, you can't do that because of the trade union laws, and we say, no, we've got a Corbyn government, we demand that they actually break away from their trade union laws. What impact would that have across British society? What if the mass strike took place under a Corbyn government? What climate would change? Where would that put the far right? Would it put them on the defensive? Would people like Farage suddenly get very shaky, very nervous about their interests, and the Boris Johnsons and the Hunts and all the rest of them? Yes, we do have criticisms with Corbyn, but we also know that there's a world of difference between Corbyn and Farage and Johnson and Hunt, and we don't want to be so silly as to think that there isn't that difference.
Thank you. I just wanted to really agree with the last person who spoke that we have to take sides in the question of Corbynism, and all of the limitations that we've discussed, we're discussing fraternally among friends, and we can only discuss these things on the basis that we absolutely stand on the side of Corbyn against the right. And I don't just mean the right in the Tory party, who we absolutely have to stand against, I also mean the right in the Labour Party, because who is one of my local councillors quite rightly pointed out, there is an ongoing battle in the Labour Party to undermine Jeremy Corbyn from within, and this isn't something that any socialists can abstract themselves from. And if we want to have a socialist society, which we absolutely do and we urgently need, we have to actually concretely engage in the politics as it exists in the world in which we live. And actually, in my workplace, the people who are Corbyn supporters are the best people. And they are the people that I organise with against racism, against the cuts in the NHS, and really against anything, any attacks that we're facing and any struggles that we want to have. And with those people, I have lots of debates about the limitations of Corbynism, and I want to go much further than Corbynism. But we have to start in a position of what unites us, and we have to start by taking sides on these questions. And actually, I think if we want to get to a socialist society, which, as I say, we do, and we really absolutely need, to win working class people to that, it's going to be very hard if we can't even prove that we can get rid of this rotten Tory government and get a Labour government. But we want to have the self-organisation of the masses of working class people. Actually, revolutions don't happen, as Lenin quite rightly said, because people declare a revolution and line up on one side and say we're revolutionaries. They go through twists and turns of the class struggle, and a large part of that is building the confidence on our side. And that means we always take sides on every debate, and then we can argue about all of the other questions.
Now I'm going to bring Jane to talk for 10 minutes.
Okay, well, my summing up should really be it's what Amy said, and then I should sit down. But I will say a couple of things. Sorry, I thought I said Esme. Right, I think to go back to what I said at the beginning, which is that the manifesto, this Labour Party's manifesto, is hugely, hugely refreshing. If we go back to before Corbyn, we'd had 4 decades of people talking about the market, talking about individualism, low levels of struggle. This is a complete break with those ideas. It talks about taxing the rich. It talks about reining in large companies. It raises issues about workers' democracy. Now, I've given a critique of that, not because we're writing them off, because we need to have those sort of debates. And to write off Corbyn and say that we don't want him as Prime Minister is very dangerous. For a start, it cuts us off from the 500,000 people who've joined the Labour Party, who are inspired by those ideas and who want to engage with them. So it's very, very important that we recognise that. And even at a very basic level, ideas about more spending on education, on health, on the environment, in the short term would materially improve the lives of working class people. And I don't think we should in any way minimise that. In terms of the challenge that Manny made down, what would be a radical programme? I don't think the important is what would be in a blueprint. I think we could all have ideas about rates of taxation, better ideas about housing. It's not the nature of the demand, it's about how we're actually going to get there. And the importance of the Corbyn and McDonnell agenda is that they do raise expectations, that they do inspire much broader struggles against austerity. And what those struggles have the power to do is, first of all, to kick out the Tories. But much more than that, they have the power to go beyond the logic of reform, beyond the logic of capitalism, and start to build the sort of democracy of below that we want to see. So we do fight along, members of the Labour Party. We don't, if they're fighting against a hospital closure, against academies, on the nature of the environment, then we fight alongside them, and we have friendly but critical discussions about the way that things are going to go. And it's our understanding that the critique is what makes us friendly to reformists on the left, but ultimately it's what makes us revolutionaries.